1. The Whispering Trees. Last summer, my friends and I decided to go camping deep in the woods. It was the perfect spot, isolated with no one around for miles, but as soon as night fell, we started hearing strange whispers. At first, we thought it was the wind rustling through the trees, but then we realized the voices were saying our names. We tried to ignore it, but the voices grew louder, almost like they were coming from just behind us. We grabbed our flashlights and scanned the area, but there was nothing there. In the morning, we found strange markings on the trees near our campsite, almost like scratches or claw marks. We didn't stay another night. 2. The Man in the Cabin. A group of us were camping near an old, abandoned cabin in the woods. We had heard stories about the place, how it was once the home of a hermit who disappeared years ago. The first night, we decided to check it out. The door creaked as we opened it, and it was covered in dust. But inside, everything seemed undisturbed, almost like someone had been living there recently. As we explored, we found a journal with strange entries. That's when we heard a noise behind us. Turning around, we saw an old man standing in the doorway. His eyes were wide and unblinking. He just stared at us for a moment, then disappeared into the darkness. We didn't waste time packing up and left immediately. 3. The Shadow in the Firelight. We were sitting around the campfire when one of our friends, Mark, pointed out something strange. A figure standing just outside the light of the fire, barely visible in the shadows. We thought it was just one of the trees, but when we looked closely, the figure seemed to move. It wasn't human, it was too tall, with long, spindly limbs. Mark insisted he saw it clearly, but the rest of us were skeptical until we all saw it at the same time. Suddenly, the figure darted toward us, disappearing into the trees. We didn't sleep much that night, and by morning, we were already packing up to leave. 4. The Forgotten Trail. We decided to take a hike down an old, forgotten trail during our camping trip. The trail had been abandoned for years, but we were curious. The deeper we went, the more uncomfortable it felt. The trees grew denser, and the air turned colder. After walking for hours, we came across a strange, dilapidated shack in the middle of nowhere. Inside, we found old photographs and newspaper clippings about people who had gone missing in the woods. That's when we heard footsteps outside. When we peeked out, there was no one there, but we saw footprints in the dirt leading away from the shack, disappearing into the thick woods. We didn't stick around to investigate further. 5. The Eyes in the Night. One of the scariest nights of our camping trip happened when we were in the middle of a secluded forest. We were all in our tents when we suddenly heard strange rustling noises around the campsite. We peeked out of our tents and saw hundreds of eyes watching us from the darkness, glowing faintly, like they belonged to some kind of animal. But the eyes didn't blink. They just stared, unmoving. We grabbed our stuff and tried to leave, but the eyes followed us the whole way, staying just out of reach. By the time we reached the car, the eyes had disappeared. We never spoke about it again, but none of us went camping there again. Hope you enjoy these spooky stories. 6. The Disappearing Hiker. A couple of years ago, a group of friends and I went camping in a remote national park in California. Everything was going smoothly until one night we noticed one of our group members, Jake, was missing. We had all been sitting around the fire, and when we turned around, Jake wasn't there. We called out for him, but there was no answer. After an hour of searching, we found his flashlight just off the trail, still on, but there was no sign of Jake. We searched for hours through the dense woods, but we never found him. The next morning, the park rangers found his backpack, but Jake was never seen again. To this day, no one knows what happened to him. 7. The Screams in the Forest. A friend of mine went camping with his brother in a state park in Oregon. They set up their tent near a small stream, and as night fell, everything seemed peaceful. But around midnight, they heard what they described as blood-curdling screams coming from deeper in the forest. They thought it was just an animal, but the screams continued for hours, and they were unlike anything they had ever heard before. Terrified, they decided to pack up and leave in the middle of the night. As they were leaving, they heard footsteps following them, but when they looked back, there was no one there. They never went camping in that park again. 8. The vanishing campsite. A hiker from Montana shared a story about his experience in the mountains. He and his friend decided to camp in a secluded area far from the usual trails. They set up their tent, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. The next morning, they woke up to find their entire campsite gone. No tent, no fire pit, no gear. It was as if the place had been completely erased. The trees around them seemed unnaturally still, and there was no sign of any human presence. After hours of searching, they found the trail they had originally hiked, but when they looked back, there was no trace of the campsite, not even footprints. To this day, he has no explanation for what happened. 9. The creepy ranger. My cousin went camping in the Appalachian Mountains with some friends. One evening, they met a park ranger who was very friendly at first, but quickly became a bit too interested in their plans. He kept asking personal questions about where they were going, how long they planned to stay, and whether they were traveling alone. It felt off, but they didn't think much of it at the time. That night, they woke up to strange noises outside their tent, footsteps, whispering, and the sound of something brushing against the tent. When they looked out, the ranger was standing just outside, staring at them. He didn't move for a long time, and when they finally checked in the morning, he was gone. The only thing they found was a pair of muddy boots near their tent. They packed up immediately and left. 10. The shadow figure. A family went camping in the wilderness of Wyoming. After setting up camp, they spent the day hiking and exploring the area. As night approached, they gathered around the campfire, but as they sat there, they started to notice a strange figure in the distance. It was tall, dark, and seemed to be watching them from the tree line. Every time they looked away and then back again, the figure was closer. It never moved, but its presence was unmistakable. Around midnight, they decided to sleep in their car, too scared to stay outside. The next morning, the figure was gone, but they found large, unnatural footprints leading from the tree line to their camp. No one could explain what they saw, but they left the area immediately. These stories may sound unbelievable, but the people who experience them swear by their truth. What do you think?